This lab is about gravimetric analysis of soluble chloride. In this experiment, you are given an unknown sample. By doing gravimetric analysis, you should be able to determine the percent chloride in your unknown sample. In this short pre-lab lecture, we will first clarify what a gravimetric analysis is, and then we will talk about the requirements of a good gravimetric analysis and why excess amount of precipitating agent is used in such analysis. Then we will go through a summary of the experiment you are going to do in the lab, and finally we will talk about the calculation you will need for this experiment. Gravimetric analysis is defined as quantitative isolation of the analyte of interest from the sample in highly pure form or in some combined form and weighing the isolated analyte. Here you can see two examples of gravimetric analysis. In the first example, gold is precipitated in the pure form from the solution using sodium bisulfite as the precipitating agent. In the second example, barium is precipitated in the combined form when sodium sulfate is used as precipitating agent. Here you can see a summary of the procedure generally used in gravimetric analysis. You have a solution containing your analyte. A precipitating agent, here silver nitrate, is added, which results in a precipitate containing the analyte. In the next step, the precipitate is filtered, dried, and finally, based on the weight of precipitate, you can determine the percent chloride you had initially in your sample. The three major requirements for a good gravimetric analysis are that, first, the precipitating agent will react only with the analyte of interest to form a precipitate. Second, the precipitating agent forms one and only one product with the analyte. And third, that the analyte precipitates quantitatively from solution. That means almost all of the analyte precipitates. In any gravimetric analysis, you should make sure an excess amount of precipitating agent is added. But why? Whenever you have a saturated solution of an ionic compound like sodium chloride or silver chloride, part of the ions are in the form of solid or precipitate, and the other part of the ions dissolve in the solution as free ions. For some ionic compounds like sodium chloride, the concentration of free ions in the solution is high, and therefore they have a large solubility product. On the other hand, some ionic compounds like silver chloride have a low solubility product. Therefore, most of the ions are in the form of precipitate. However, we still have free ions in such solutions. So, excess amount of precipitating agent, here silver nitrate, is added. Based on the Le Chatelet principle, chemical equilibrium goes to the left, and so we can assume all the chloride ions are in the form of silver chloride and only negligible amount of free chloride ions remain in the solution. Therefore, when you weigh the precipitate in a gravimetric analysis, you can be sure almost all the analyte, here chloride ions, are in the form of precipitate. Now, let's talk about the procedure of the experiment 2 we are going to do in the lab. Before starting experiment 2, first make sure to complete experiment 1 if you haven't already. Experiment 2 is a 3-day lab. In day 1, which is today, you are going to clean 3 filter crucibles and put them in the oven for the next lab. When cleaning the crucibles, please make sure you do all the 3 cleaning steps mentioned in your lab manual. That means, first wash the crucibles with ammonium hydroxide, then with nitric acid, and finally with hydrochloric acid. Please make sure to dispose ammonium hydroxide left in the flask into the base waste container before starting washing the crucibles with acids. Here you can see the setup you need for cleaning the crucibles. You need to clean 3 crucibles. You can do all 3 at the same time if you have access to enough vacuum systems. To do so, first open the valve and connect the tube and the rubber hose with the crucible on top to a filter flask. Make sure you have some DI water in the flask before starting cleaning the crucibles. Make sure you rinse the crucible with large amount of DI water after each cleaning step. After cleaning, use a permanent marker to mark crucibles, or you can put the 3 crucibles in a large beaker and put it in the oven for the next lap. Don't forget to label the beaker. Steps 3 to 5 are for the next lap after your crucibles are dried in the oven. If you have enough time, you can start doing the next step of your experiment. From your unknown chloride sample, weigh out accurately by difference 3 portions of the dried sample of about 0.5 to 0.7 gram, each to within 0.1 milligram. Dissolve each portion in a clean separate labeled beaker, using 150 ml of distilled water to which about 1 ml of concentrated nitric acid has been added. Heat the chloride solution on a hot plate and add excess amount of silver nitrate according to the procedure. Stir constantly with a glass stirring rod. Let it settle and check the precipitate completion by adding a few drops of silver nitrate to your beaker. Place the beaker in the assigned cabinet for the next lap. In day 3 of the lap, filter the silver chloride precipitate through a weighed crucible with suction. Wash the precipitate in the beaker with nitric acid and quantitatively transfer silver chloride precipitate to the crucible. Place the crucible containing silver chloride precipitate in the oven for the next lap. Next lap, you will weigh the crucible and based on the weight of silver chloride precipitate, you can calculate the percent chloride in your unknown sample. Make sure you know the important concepts of experiment 2 and know how to solve the related problems. In day 3 of experiment 2, you also need to prepare 2 solutions you will need for experiment 3. So, prepare an EDTA solution and a calcium standard solution. Also, please submit a zinc unknown container to your TA for experiment 3. In your lab report, you will need gravimetric factor in order to calculate the percent chloride in your unknown sample. A gravimetric factor is a number used to convert the weight of one chemical to the weight of another. For example, the gravimetric factor for silver chloride is defined as molecular weight of chlorine over the molecular weight of silver chloride. When you have the gravimetric factor of silver chloride and the mass of silver chloride precipitate you obtained, you can calculate the mass of chloride in your unknown sample. But you are asked to report the percent chloride and not the mass of chloride. To do so, we need to divide mass of chloride by the mass of initial chloride sample your TA gave you in the beginning of the experiment 2. In your lab report for experiment 2, make sure you have all the required data and calculation. At least show calculation for one complete trial and don't forget significant figures. For any experiment you do in the lab, particularly for experiment 2, make sure you wear gloves. If you have any questions about experiment 2, please let the TAs know.